Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Food for Thought Speaker Series panel on building trust between police and the communities they serve. Today, we are honored to have Professor Basil Smikle, New York State Attorney General Letitia James, and State Attorney for Baltimore City, Marilyn Mosby. Professor William Emick will be introducing our honored guests, and we're very happy to have them as part of our EMPA Food for Thought Speaker Series. Now I'm going to hand it off to Professor Emick.
Thank you, Jeremy. I've been here for several decades. I've never been more honored to be part of an event than this one. Not only are each one of our panelists spectacular in their own right, but they're three of the best known people, I believe, in this country right now, speaking on the issues that we're all confronting and dealing with that hopefully will make the United States a better place. I think it will. I'm an optimist, and knowing these three people, I know if it can happen, they'll make it happen. So if I read their bios, we'd have no time left for the presentation. So I'll just give the highlights. Letitia Tish James is the Attorney General for New York State. She was the first woman of color elected to a statewide office, the first woman to be Attorney General. I have known her for 2 decades. She has been causing trouble in New York State, probably since she was born, but certainly for the last 20 years. She served on the city council. She was public advocate. She worked in the Attorney General's office years ago. She's been in the community, she's been in government, she's an elected official, she's an attorney, she's a scholar, she's a speaker, she's a public TV person. She's terrific. Thank you for joining us. I don't know Marilyn as well, except by her fame and her constant appearances and really memorable appearances on television. She is, not surprisingly, the youngest person elected to state attorney in the United States.
I don't know about anymore.
Yeah, well, you can always pass for that. You look much younger than my daughter, which makes me feel very, very old. But in addition to her major accomplishments since she became an elected official, she is truly a major scholar. She was a presidential scholarship winner where she entered Tuskegee University. She graduated magna cum laude. She was a Thurgood Marshall Scholarship winner. She got a JD from Boston College Law School. She's been active in U.S. attorney and local attorney, state attorneys' offices. She's been in the private sector as an attorney. She's won really too many awards to even list all the awards that she's won. And a tremendously accomplished person. And for both of them, I think it's important to recognize that these are major officials in law enforcement. We sometimes lose the perspective because of who they are and what they have to say, but they are integral people in law enforcement in the United States. So their perspectives are not just as advocates and scholars and elected officials, but as people who are law enforcement professionals. And then finally, my good friend, my long-term friend and colleague, Basil Smikle, who has been here and around Columbia University for several decades, has his PhD and his master's degree from Columbia. And what I think some of our students don't realize is he too was a major player in politics. He was the executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. Maybe he doesn't want me to remind everybody of that. But he now is a scholar and a professor and a writer and a television commentator. And he is extremely good at all those things. And one of the best people I've met in my life. So it's an honor to be with you three, and I'll turn it over to Basil to start the proceedings.
Thank you so much, Bill. Attorney General Letitia James, State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby, I really thank you both for joining us today. I thought we would just begin with a few opening remarks, just some initial thoughts about where we are in America today, particularly on the subject of criminal justice. By the way, I have some questions to ask, and we are opening a Q&A for the participants on today's call, on today's webinar. I will see those questions and pose a few to both of you, time permitting. I will just use my New York connection and ask Attorney General Letitia James, if you don't mind, to say a few words and talk a little bit about where we are right now and some of what you're working on.
So thank you, Basil. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for your friendship over the years. We go back a long time. And of course, I want to thank Professor Emick for his kind words and his invitation. As Professor Emick knows, I attended SEPA. I need to go back and finish my degree. Got caught up in something known as politics. I want to thank him, obviously, for his outstanding leadership and his service to New York City and the state, as well as our nation. This Food for Thought lecture is just one of the many innovations he has brought to SEPA as the founding director of the Picker Center. Of course, I want to join my partner and my sister in justice, my co-panelists, Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby. We are on panels together. I thank her for her leadership and for her intelligence and for being so graceful in the midst of so many challenges, particularly now as we face our perspectives on how to build trust between the police and the communities we serve. It's a very timely topic. As some of you know, my office has been tasked with investigating the interactions between NYPD and the public during the recent protests related to the killing of George Floyd. Let me say at the outset that the First Amendment guarantees the right to peaceful protest, and it is my responsibility and duty to guard and protect that right, and I will do that. It is also important that individuals understand that this really is a teaching moment in the history of this country, and that the civil rights movement, particularly the Montgomery boycott, it lasted over 365 days before individuals received justice. And so these individuals, these young people who are primarily marching for all of us, they've only been marching a few weeks. And so I, again, will guard and protect their right to raise their voices and to petition their government. I also believe that we cannot ignore the underlying causes for the protests across our state and our nation, and I know that we're going to get into it. George Floyd's death, his killing, may have lit the spark for change, but it is just the latest in a long line of racially charged killings from African Americans, from Amadou Diallo to Sean Bell to Eric Gardner. I have marched in a fair share of protests dating back to a very long period of time in New York State. I was counsel to the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, where we came up with a package of bills in the early 90s in response to police killings and police abuse. And so I've been in this business for a long time. The never-ending cycle of needless death has awakened the conscience of America and indeed the entire world as a result of the ability to catch it on film, to catch it on a camera. And these civilian journalists obviously has turned this moment into a defining moment in the history of our nation. And so my investigation I take very seriously. And I just want to briefly share with you where we are. In about 2 hours, I will be releasing it to the general public. But since May 30th, we've received over 1,300 submissions through our dedicated portal and through emails and through the phone. Individuals have submitted testimony. I held a public hearing over a 3-day period of time where I sat through and listened to 100 witnesses who were primarily protesters, who were engaging in peaceful protest. We've heard from elected officials, we heard from civic leaders, we've heard from attorneys, and we heard from the police commissioner of the city of New York. We've received 300 written testimony, 300 submissions of written testimony, including from police unions. We've also received data and video and other evidence from NYPD. I want to thank NYPD for their cooperation. Our investigation remains ongoing because the protests are ongoing. So In a few hours, we will release a preliminary report, but it is impossible to deny that many New Yorkers, unfortunately, have lost faith in law enforcement. And to build public trust, we must have public accountability. And we will talk about that today. We will continue to investigate the use of force employed by the NYPD. We're going to investigate and look at this, mechanism known as kettling, where police basically surround protesters on all sides. We're going to examine their arrest-related practices that have resulted in reported injuries in many cases, where individuals' hands were zip-tied too tightly, where they were taken to other boroughs to be processed, where the police allegedly mistreated the press and legal observers and elected officials and even essential workers, particularly during that curfew period. We will continue to investigate other practices, such as police officers who did not wear mask or they hid their badge numbers and their name tags. And at the end of our investigation, we will complete and produce a final report with recommendations and fact-finding. But it's important that we embrace bold ideas and that we continue to pursue change so that we could heal the breach that currently exists between NYPD. Democracy cannot die in the dark. It's really critically important that we embrace change. It will require that we have sustained vigilance and that all people are brought to the table, including police unions and members of the public, so that we can have some accountability, some transparency over our policing. The police cannot police themselves. That's one message that we have learned. And we really need to address the over-policing, and we need to make sure that all voices are not shut out, but that they are heard. All that the protesters want at this point in time is to be heard. And I gave them an opportunity to be heard, but all of us must give them an opportunity to be heard and to have their voices be included in policy, not only in the city, but the state of New York. I look forward to hearing from Attorney General Mosby, as well as to Professor Basil and the audience. I understand your students call you Professor Basil, so I hope you don't mind if I call you Professor Basil as well.
Not at all, and I do appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Marilyn Mosby, if you can just say a few words. Thank you so much, Tish, by the way.
Thank you.
And we'll certainly look forward to unpacking a lot of that information that you brought for us this afternoon. Marilyn Mosby, I have to say, Baltimore is a city that's near and dear to my heart. My fraternity chapter is there. So I do spend some time there. I'll make sure to say hello the next time I'm down.
Please do.
And to echo Bill's point earlier, you're someone that I've seen on the front lines of so much of the work that is being done on justice and criminal justice reform. So thank you for being here, and please, if you can give us a few words about where we are today and what you're working on.
So first and foremost, I am so honored to be on this esteemed panel with all of you. Columbia Law School, Attorney General James, she talked about being a sister in justice. She's a pioneer and has been in this game trying to push for criminal justice reform and a spark that has ignited what is happening in our country right now. And so I'm grateful to once again be on a panel with you. So first and foremost, I want to just say thank you for inviting me to be a part of this really important discussion. And what we've seen in the past couple of months, and it hasn't been that long. It feels like it's been an eternity. But as a result of the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks, we're finally talking about criminal justice reform, and it's no longer this second tier sort of issue, but is now on front and center in the political conversation. And I have to credit the protests and the activists who have done that, right? Black Lives Matter is no longer a controversial sort of thing to say. And for so long, it was. The veil, as Attorney General has already indicated, I'm a Tuskegee alumni, so the veil of ignorance has been lifted from Americans in this country regarding police relations and race relations and police brutality against Black people, Black and brown people in this country. So I'm encouraged by this moment. And it's a quite unique moment, I think, that we're facing, but it can be all meaningless without real political change. And we have to move from protest to policy. So for me, you know, watching George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis raises disturbing questions, right? Why was the officer kneeling on this man's neck? Why won't the officer respond to his pleas for help? Why won't the officers intervene, right? But 5 years ago in Baltimore City, the residents were asking the same questions after an innocent 25-year-old Black man by the name of Freddie Carlos Gray Jr. made eye contact with police, who was unconstitutionally arrested, placed into a metal wagon head first, feet shackled, and handcuffed. And after his spine was partially severed in the back of that wagon, his pleas for medical attention were ignored. And so I find myself going through and living through this experience all over again. And since the eruption of the Floyd case, I've also wrestled with other sort of questions. What happened before the cameras rolled, right? Why was Mr. Floyd in this position in the first place? And what we know is that he was attempting to allegedly pass a $20 bill for groceries, survival in a global pandemic, right? That in and of itself is problematic. And when we think about these killings, Eric Garner was allegedly selling a loose cigarette. Sandra Bland failed to use a turn signal. Freddie Gray merely made eye contact with police in a high crime neighborhood and decided to run. In this moment, you know, I think it's incredibly important now that the public is educated and thoughtful about criminal justice and policing issues. It's now time for innovative sort of reform and ultimately the courage to create a more fair and just criminal justice system. And as prosecutors, right? And this is why I'm so happy to be on this panel. Prosecutors are the ones who decide who's going to be charged, what they're going to be charged with, what sentence recommendations we're going to make. We make a determination as to whether or not an individual is going to get in the criminal justice system in the first place. 95% of those individuals making those decisions about our communities that have disproportionately impacted poor Black and brown communities, 95% of them are white in this country. 79% are white men. As a woman of color, with Attorney General James, we represent 1% of all elected prosecutors in this country. And so it's one of accountability and one of a time in which we have to think about those innovative approaches, and I look forward to doing that today.
Oh, thank you very much. I actually want to stay with you for a second. You know, as Bill talked about the fact that both of you were in law enforcement, over the last few weeks with all of the turmoil and interest and desire for folks to get educated on the issues of race and criminal justice reform, they've been reading lists thrown out, documentaries that have been suggested. I myself went back and watched 13th, which is probably something I do every 6 months to a year or so, just to make sure that some of these issues stay fresh in my mind if I'm not experiencing it directly. But it's important to sort of get a handle on where our system is and has been. And that's essentially my question, that if you pay attention to that documentary and to all of the research that's been done, considering the racist origins of policing in this country, considering the statistics you just threw out, Marilyn, about that you two represent the 1% of the prosecutors in this country. I've had students here at SEPA who are in law enforcement. One of my former students is a 25-year veteran of the DEA. And he has this question also: how do we build trust with a system or with departments, law enforcement agencies, when they've had such racist origins, but there are more and more of us on the front lines as a result of that? People have gone into law enforcement because they wanted to make a difference, wanted to make change, but still may not feel that they can trust a system that was never designed for them in the first place. How do How do you respond and bring those two things together?
So the one thing I will say is I'm incredibly encouraged, and you're absolutely right. The racist origins of law enforcement and policing in this country is apparent, and it's been blatant since the time that we were brought here in the inception of slavery, you know, with the enforcement of slave codes, the 13th Amendment, the abolishment of slavery, with the only exception being that of criminals. And since that time, poor Black and brown people have been painted as criminals. So through Jim Crow, through the civil rights movement, through the war on drugs, which we now know was really a war on Black people, right? And the mass incarceration. So historically, you're absolutely right. What do we do in this moment? And I'm encouraged because there's an acknowledgement. For so long, people would not acknowledge those racial sort of, that origin. And that white supremacy was the basis of a lot of that, right? So I think that I'm encouraged that we're acknowledging it. And now the question is, what do we do about it? And so I think it's a very unique time. And what I can say is, first and foremost, we have to have representation, right? To represent 1% of all elected prosecutors in the country, that is problematic, right? And it's not just in the prosecution world, but in policing, that we need representation. I can tell you that my grandfather was one of the founding members of the first Black police organization in Massachusetts, right? And I can remember always coming home and seeing different people at my house and being like, they'd be like, hey, cuz, I'm like, I don't even know you. Like, who are you? Right? And he constantly had people there that were coming into our homes, and he was providing and they were borrowing money. And it wasn't until I was in Baltimore 2 years ago, and my grandfather passed away a month after I was sworn in, and this man walked up to me and he said, hey, aren't you Marilyn Mosby? I said, I am. He said, well, I just want to thank you. I said, thank me for what? He said, I want to thank you for Mr. T. Mr. T was my grandfather. He said, I would not be the man that I am today if it wasn't for your grandfather. And it hit me all those times when I was coming home, right? My grandfather was not only a paternal figure for me and my family, but for the community that he represented. He epitomized community policing, and you have to be at the table. That's first and foremost. Second, I think it's time to really reimagine public safety and policing in this country. For far too long, we have relied on the police department to respond to every social ill of our society. We've criminalized the mentally ill. We've criminalized those with substance use disorder. And we have an expectation that police should just engage and that this is not going to impact the community sort of relationship. And so understanding and recognizing that police are not experts in drug use or homelessness and mental health, we need to divest in the police. I'm not saying defund, but I'm saying divest into these services and put it into organizations with experts that are dealing with these social ills of society. That's one. And then from a prosecutor's sort of perspective, the one thing that I hearken on, and I wrote an op-ed in reference in the New York Times about this, was prosecutors should be evaluating the types of cases that we handle. One of the reasons why I stopped last year, 2019, prosecuting marijuana possession, regardless of weight, regardless of criminal history, is that this was being applied in a discriminatory fashion against poor Black and brown people in the city of Baltimore, even despite there was no disparate sort of use among white and Black people. So evaluating that, these quality of life offenses, right, put the lives of Black people in jeopardy because they're disproportionately enforced against Black people and generate an interaction with police that has nothing to do with public safety. In the height of COVID, one of the things that I said, we're not prosecuting drug possession at all. We're not prosecuting sex work at all. So using that discretion to evaluate and ensure that you're limiting that type of interaction between police and the community.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to Letitia James on that same question. And I want to thank John Austin for submitting that earlier. But on that same question, again, how do you create that balance? And to riff off of something that Marilyn Mosby said, there are calls to defund the police right now. And Jim Clyburn, for example, has said that he doesn't support the language at least, but he supports the theory that you could alter funding and processes in police departments so that it is being more responsive. And he was concerned about the language that was used, because, you know, we're all in politics and understand language and so on. And the truth be told, the President Trump, has already got a commercial up attacking folks who support defunding the police. So, you know, how do we bridge that divide between law enforcement and community? And is defunding the right response?
So first, let me just say that defunding the police is nothing more than a hashtag. And defunding the police means a lot of things to a lot of different people. It's really about reprioritizing our values as a nation and as a respective state, and focusing on issues that police officers are ill-trained to be involved in, such as mental illness, the homelessness, transportation issues, traffic-related issues. And so it's really critically important that we understand this hashtag and this movement known as defunding the police. It's not defunding the police. It's again taking resources out and committing it to social services and to social issues that the police are in a poor position to address, and they are poorly trained to address these issues. And that's why a number of individuals have gotten behind it. But I do know that it has been used by this president for political purposes. I think it's important, one, to distinguish my office from that of Ms. Mosby. My office is primarily civil. It's not criminal in nature. We have limited jurisdiction in the criminal realm. Criminal jurisdiction is primarily left in the state of New York to the district attorneys across our state. We have 62 district attorneys. My responsibility is primarily serving as the state's attorney for state agencies, as well as for the governor, as well as for the state legislature, and engaging in pattern and practice cases, and having the ability to investigate the police when it comes to assaults and or the killing of police, the killing of civilians by police, whether or not they are armed and or unarmed. It's also important that this audience understand the history of race in this country, and that the policies that have been put in place, particularly in this country, are oftentimes coded in race. It's called The Color of Race, and I urge everyone to read the book by Leon Higginbotham called The Color of Race, going back to, as Marilyn mentioned, slave codes, Black codes, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, racial covenants, exclusionary zoning policies, housing discrimination, taxation, subsidies, the fact that the GI Bill, when Black officers were released from the Army, they were not entitled to certain benefits that their white counterparts were entitled to. We've got to talk about, again, the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement gained us some rights which we should have had from the beginning. We've got to talk about, again, racial profiling, as was mentioned. We've got to talk about Brown versus Board of Education, housing discrimination and housing segregation, and how policies, both on the local, state, and federal level, where implicit racial policies are embedded into our laws. And so this is not going to be easy, where we sort of analyze laws, not only in New York, but all across our nation, and try to demystify the issue of race and try to separate out issues that disproportionately affect people of color. We are seeing it as it relates to COVID-19. We are seeing the fault lines along race in terms of healthcare. And now we are seeing it in our criminal justice system. But the issue, again, affects us in just about every facet of our lives. And if we are to be honest and open, we need to have a discussion about race and how it impacts our lives and how it affects our laws each and every day. The color of law is real, and clearly it impacts the lives of people of color. And there is, again, the relationship between police and our communities, unfortunately, has a long history, which is why the trust will not, there's no one single investigation or silver bullet which will solve it. We've got to, again, embrace it, talk about it, allow these individuals who are protesting in our streets to be heard and to begin to have an open conversation as we are doing here at SEPA.
Thank you. So State's Attorney Mosby, I want to sort of pivot from that on, as Letitia James talked about her role as a state AG. When you became State's Attorney, you went into office in 2015 with a clear sort of idea and urgency about reshaping and retooling that office, reorganizing it perhaps. Then Freddie Gray, and I reflect on, you know, in New York when we were talking about what was happening here in New York, and I remember there were these discussions about the role of grand juries in their ability to indict police officers and how that potentially could be a barrier to justice, if you will. And we saw that in the Eric Garner case. So my question for you is, as you look at how your office operates, what are some of the barriers that you run into, whether it's our criminal justice system as it stands with things like grand juries, and even union contracts, for example? Like, what's the difficulty in how you, in seeing how we can engage justice, how we get justice, but have run into these roadblocks that seem to be pretty durable?
So first and foremost, I think that, and the reason why I'm so encouraged is the AP just recently put out a poll where they said that the matter of Americans, more than half of Americans have changed their perception about police relations and police brutality since I charged the officers in Freddie Gray. So at the time that I did that, there was a different sort of perception that was believed among a certain experience that not everybody had with reference to police. So I think that, again, the veil of ignorance has been lifted. So I think that that's encouraging. But there were a number of sort of barriers that were placed in my way. I guess I was somewhat naive in that I was in office for 4 months when Freddie Gray happened, and applying that one standard of justice where I did in every other case up until that point, I didn't understand and recognize that that was going to come with harassment and intimidation and hate mail and death threats and, you know, unions coming for you and the amount of backlash. I was sued, you know, on numerous occasions by the police officers. So I didn't understand the backlash. So I do understand that now. And having the courage, I think it starts with that accountability, right? And what we saw in Minneapolis is that you had a prosecutor who didn't want to exhibit that courage, right? He in essence was trying to deflect from his inaction and actually pointed to me as an example as to why he didn't want to pursue charges, right? So it takes a level of courage just to be able to apply one standard of justice to all, regardless of race, sex, religion, and occupation. And then I guess what I learned in all of that is that accountability, justice is always worth the price paid for its pursuit. That accountability actually led to exposure. A week after I charged those officers, the Department of Justice came in and exposed the discriminatory pattern and practice of discriminatory enforcement of the 8th largest police department in the country. Because of that exposure, we now have a federally enforceable consent decree that Trump tried to stop that is still on record. And because of that reform, we have a spotlight on the entrenched police corruption of one of the largest police departments in the country. I can point to tangible sort of reforms that were put in place as a direct result of those charges. You know, the use of force and de-escalation policies that now emphasize the sanctity of life, the body-worn cameras implementation that didn't happen before those charges. You look at the affirmative obligation of a police officer to now intervene if their fellow officers cross the line. That didn't exist before. We have cameras in every single one of the police vans. That didn't exist before. You are now required as a police officer to call a medic when requested. That didn't exist before. You are now required to seatbelt prisoners, you know, in every instance. That wasn't there before. So there are tangible sort of reforms, but one of the things that I said when I dropped the charges is that there are still systems that are in place that if we do not change, I can try this case 100 times and it will end up with the same result. One of which is, you know, as Attorney General James has already indicated, police should not be policing themselves, right? And I had to learn that the hard way, when the most pertinent questions weren't asked, when the police department refused to execute search and seizure warrants, right? When they were creating notes and then contradicting the medical examiner, turning it over to their colleagues and not turning it over to me, and the judge was ordering a discovery violation on our behalf. So there was an intentional sort of sabotage, and I'm not gonna just point to police, but no profession should be investigating theirself, right? That's a huge issue. So you should have independent police investigations when it comes to police misconduct. When we talk about police oftentimes circumventing the communities that they serve, what we find all across the country is that police officers often choose to have their case tried in front of a judge because they feel it's gonna be more deferential than in front of a distrustful jury. That's problematic, right? Because when we look at the federal system, the judge and the attorney have to sign off on that. In the state of Maryland, I didn't. So the first officer that we tried in that case, it was a hung jury, which means I can go and I can try him again. But guess what happened? The second, the third, the fourth officer, they elected a bench trial in front of the same judge over and over and over again. Police unions, as was already indicated, are a major sort of barrier to any type of reform and police accountability reform in this country. We have to defang the police unions. They mock, they ridicule, they put money into these political races, and they ensure that when it comes to police accountability, that it does not happen. And then last but certainly not least, when it comes to the elimination of these employment contracts that tie the hands of the police department to get rid of problematic officers. You know, the police unions are also pushing for there not to be transparent processes when it comes to internal affairs records. That officer in Minneapolis had 18 internal affairs complaints. It's foreseeable that he would be a problem. And guess what? The police department should be able to get rid of those types of officers. We need civilian majority participation on administrative trial boards. The officers in Freddie Gray, they were tried. 5 of them were tried. 1 of them wasn't tried because he finally gave a statement against the others. And the 5 of them that were tried in front of a panel of their peers, guess what ends up happening? 2 of them pled guilty because they didn't know it was going to happen. 2 were acquitted, and the police commissioner at the time then dismissed the other. So those are systems that have to change, and those are the starting place for real police accountability.
You know, you made a point that I think about a lot in the case of George Floyd, and you notice that as the officer is kneeling on his neck and the other officers are standing around and not reacting, the first thing I think about is they didn't see anything shocking to them, right? Almost like they've seen it before. And that to me, and as you talk about sort of the accountability, not just of the officer committing the act, but about those standing around, is extraordinarily important.
But also, Basil, it's also that the seniority system.
Yeah.
The officer whose knee was on his neck was a very senior member, and the others were relatively new.
Right, right.
And so it was difficult. I mean, I guess I don't want to defend their behavior, but I've heard accounts that, an inferior basically cannot step up and intervene when it relates to a superior officer.
And that speaks to culture, right? That speaks to culture and peer pressure. And so one of the things I was going to ask you is, as a statewide elected, we talk about transparency and accountability in terms of wearing cameras and so on. Sometimes, particularly in the case of this gentleman that was going bird watching in Central Park, sometimes I think we're the ones that should be wearing cameras to hold everybody else accountable. But then I'm just like, we didn't do anything wrong, so why should we? But when I think about how we change some of these entrenched systems, we've seen at the federal level an attempt to nationalize some reforms. Is that really possible? Do you think that's possible nationally and statewide, particularly when you think about what we were just talking about in terms of these cultures within police departments? I mean, that's something, you've got 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. Like, how do you create national or even statewide reforms that address all of that?
Well, let me just say, I don't know whether or not we can do that at this juncture in the history of this country, perhaps after November. But I think what we need to do really, as a nation, we need to, and as individual states, we need to reconsider the very fundamentals of how we as a society want to be policed. And part of the report that is about to be issued, again, calls for, basically democratizing our police, and that the public should have more of a say, and that police really should be held accountable to the civilians that they serve. We need more transparency and more accountability, because the police, unfortunately, at this point in time, all across this nation, are set apart from the public. And there is this attitude of us versus them. And that really should not be the case. And so it's important that in New York City, the police commissioner should not be the sole arbiter of discipline for police. He should not be the sole arbiter of promotion. He should not be the sole arbiter of hiring. And as you mentioned, as a former public advocate in the aftermath of Eric Garner, we need more transparency into the grand jury process, because again, it's cloaked with secrecy. And the only individuals who have knowledge of what happens in a grand jury proceeding is a DA and those grand juries. And so, as you know, as the public advocate, I went to court to get the grand jury minutes, but the decision basically said that the grand jury was sacrosanct. We need to change the law as it relates to that. And because now of an executive order in the aftermath of Eric Garner, which I called for as the public advocate, I now have the responsibility to investigate police whenever they are killed at the hands of police, because of the inherent conflict between district attorneys and police, who rely upon police each and every day to further the criminal justice system, and they rely upon in order to process their cases. So, and all of the reforms that Attorney General Mosby mentioned, all of those must be incorporated. And I'm so glad that the state legislature has passed some of them, as well as the city council in New York City. But obviously more needs to be done. But I think the most important thing is that we have to democratize our police force here in New York State, and they need to be held accountable to civilians.
You mentioned something earlier, and I want to make sure that I hit on it. If I remember correctly, the state legislature just passed and codified an executive order of the governor that allowed you as Attorney General to step in certain cases. Could you talk about what those cases are? What's that trigger?
Sure. They not only codified my ability, the Attorney General's ability to investigate cases involving the civilians who die at the hands of police. Previously, the executive order limited my jurisdiction to those situations where civilians were unarmed. The state legislature has now expanded it to investigate cases where civilians are both armed and unarmed, and unfortunately die at the result of a police interaction. And that's what's really critically important. In addition to that, as you know, they also passed a law which would allow state police to have body cameras. In the aftermath of Eric Garner, I was one of the first to call for body cameras. It was also part of our lawsuit as it relates to the stop and frisk abuses that we saw in New York City. And so now all police, all members of the police force are equipped with body-worn cameras. But the problem is that there are no rules and there are no laws as it relates to the release of the footage. And so again, it is up to the police commissioner, based on his own individual discretion, to release body-worn camera footage. And that really should not be the case. And so one of the recommendations that we are putting forth is that the legislature and or the city council should put forth a law which requires the police commissioner to release that footage after a certain period of time. It should not take a FOIL request, a Freedom of Information request, for the police department to release those footage. The police commissioner will tell you, well, it's very expensive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But again, democracy should not die in the dark. And it's important that we have a police force that is accountable to the public that they serve.
And so, Marilyn Mosby, for for Baltimore, you raised the issue of, you raised Breonna Taylor's name, and I just want to make sure I say her name, Breonna Taylor. You raised her name. And you see what's happening there in terms of the police not being called to justice there. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, as you mentioned protests earlier as well, what we saw in Ferguson with the conversations around the militarization of our police departments. What is there a way to address that in a city like Baltimore, where we've had decades across the country of this increasing militarization of our police department? Is that something that the city, you as a state's attorney, can address, can lobby for? Is that necessary? Is that something that's worth addressing in this moment?
So one thing is, before we move on to the militarization of police, I just want to be clear. I think that when we talk about accountability, and I don't disagree with Madam Attorney General with regard to her being given the power to be able to investigate these types of cases, we have to be really careful though, right? Because in some instances, not in your particular instance, you're actually an elected official. There has been discussion about removing the power and the discretion of prosecutors, local prosecutors, and giving that to state prosecutors and individuals that are appointed to go ahead and to look into these types of cases. We can set a really bad precedence. We have to be very careful about that, because if you get a position that is appointed, it's appointed by a political party, and guess what? There's no accountability to the community.
Right.
The beauty of being a local elected official, making these decisions and applying one standard of justice, is that you are accountable to the people who have elected you. And if you do not do your job, the people can vote you out. That's what happened in Ferguson. That's what happened in Chicago. And I can go on and on and on. So I can tell you that with that accountability, you asked about changing culture. When the first the full implementation of body-worn cameras were on all officers, what we found was that the officers started reenacting the discovery and seizure of evidence and not placing it in their statement of probable cause. That's a problem. And what I said was, guess what? You do it, I'm dropping your cases, and guess what else? It looks like you are planting evidence, and I'm gonna charge you, right? So that changed the culture. They don't do that in the city of Baltimore anymore. When we had that one standard of justice in Freddie Gray, we subsequently convicted over 21 police officers. That accountability standard is incredibly important. And what we saw in Minneapolis is that with a prosecutor who was unwilling to do that, a local prosecutor, it exacerbated distrust. But when we saw Paul Howard come out and decisively make a decision, it did not. So we just got to be really careful about trying to, take those powers away, especially from people who are actually doing their jobs and trying to change that culture. With regard to the militarization of police, it's a huge problem. And I think that this is where the federal government takes a role, and that they can provide financial incentives for these states to stop it, right? Point blank period. I went to Congress and testified on marijuana and legalizing marijuana from the federal level. They have implemented so many of these policies that are directly affecting the states, but they can incentivize the states to do the right thing with these financial incentives.
And Basil, one other issue that we didn't discuss as it relates to looking at culture is the diversity of the departments.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in New York, the rank and file reflects the beautiful diversity of the city of New York, but the leadership does not.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important that we have departments that reflect the city of New York and the state of New York. We don't have a residency requirement in New York City. And so officers from outside of New York City are hired. And again, oftentimes they don't have relationships with the communities that they serve. So it's important that we again have diversity, and that we do not incentivize behavior. I was a plaintiff in the stop and frisk investigation. And what we uncovered as a result of the discovery was that there was pressure being put upon rank and file officers to basically meet quotas. And that resulted in a significant abuse of the rights of individuals as part of the stop and frisk practices of the city of New York.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because that really is an incredibly important point. And I'm going to ask you a question, but I want to ask Ms. Mosby this question first. You touched on it earlier. You talked about folks who are elected to office, and then you mentioned how few African American, particularly African American women, are prosecutors in this country. What's that like, having to run for office running for as a prosecutor? There are a lot of people that want to hear a very law and order type message from you, but at the same time, you're trying to balance that with a reform message as well. Do you think that's what contributes to perhaps so few of us getting elected across the country, trying to manage that balance? Because again, it seems like there are a lot of people that want to hear, tough on law and order from the folks that they elect to those positions.
So I would agree with you 5 years ago or 6 years ago when I was running for office initially, right? Where it was more of a tough on crime sort of approach. We were coming out of the end of that era. I think what people are looking for now is that they recognize, again, I'll point to the AP poll, their perception of the criminal justice system has changed, and they're looking for reform. They're looking for more holistic sort of approaches. And I can point to several Black women prosecutors who have been subsequently elected after me. Aramis Ayala in Orlando, Kim Gardner in St. Louis, Kim Fox in Chicago, Diana Bacta in California. I mean, I can go on, and Rachel Rollins in Boston. These were all women who were subsequently elected and who ran on a reform agenda. And it's understanding and recognizing that we bring to the table our life experiences. I don't need to take cultural sensitivity classes and implicit bias training to know how young Black men like Freddie Carlos Gray Jr. were being treated by police in this country, right? Attorney General James doesn't need to take those cultural sensitivity classes. She was a plaintiff in stop and frisk, right? So we bring to the table our life experiences. And when it comes to ensuring that one standard of justice that is applied to everybody, when it comes to ensuring that we're not only advocating for those that we believe have committed a crime, but exonerating those that have been wrongly convicted and incarcerated. Under my administration, we've exonerated over 9 individuals who served a cumulative 250 years in prison for crimes they did not commit. I was the first in the state of Maryland to have a conviction integrity unit dedicated to reinvestigations into claims of actual innocence. I created a crime control and prevention division so that we can get to young people. And in the words of Frederick Douglass, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men, right? And provide youth programs. When it comes to legislatively advocating on behalf of these police accountability reforms that we came out with a white paper 4 years ago and said that these needed to independent investigations and the elimination of employment contract. We did this 4 years ago. So I think what people are now recognizing and embracing is the need for that holistic sort of reform. And that's what we're seeing all across the country.
So let me ask you this, and I want to bring in questions from my colleague at SEPA, Esther Fuchs, and there are questions from Aurelia Brazil and Joseph Gorman that I want to bring in as well. Since we're in a policy program here at SEPA at Columbia, since we're talking public policy, and there are folks who are students that are listening from all over the world, including my family in England right now. Hey, fam. Is it possible, instead of talking about defunding police, is it possible to reform police departments in the ways that Camden has done, that Minneapolis is talking about? In England, there are a great many police officers that don't carry weapons at all. Some have suggested new officers perhaps shouldn't carry weapons for a certain period of time. Do you see that, Marilyn, as viable? Do you see them as viable reforms, something to take a look at, particularly when you're dealing with big city policing?
So I've worked with 5 police commissioners in 3 years and 4 mayors. And I can tell you that it's been rather unstable. But I can say that with my experience, I think it's incredibly, it's a really difficult sort of task, right? Because as we've already indicated, it's the culture that has to change. So to some extent, you know, it works for those officers doing their job. That accountability is being had. They don't want to be charged. They don't want to have nothing to do with it. And then there are certain individuals within that culture that will reject that. And will be counterproductive to any sort of reform. And they're encouraged and emboldened by police unions. So there are things that we have to do in order to really see the type of reform that's needed to change a culture. And so, yes, there on a lower levels, there are some things that you can implement, accountability being one, and that could marginally change the culture. But I think in order for there to be mass sort of culture change, then we would probably need to do something like it's Newark, right? Where they went in and they started over and basically set the good officers, you know, disbanded the police department and said, okay, we're doing this over. You apply all over again. You're a great officer. Come in and let's make sure that you're a part of this department. Then you're not tied to the ridiculous sort of FOP negotiations and contracts, and you start over. You start from a culture that can actually reduce crime. I mean, and that's what we saw in Newark.
And Letitia James, what now? I was reading.
I think it was Newark or Camden. Which I can't remember.
Camden. But Newark has done some work to reorganize their department as well. But the sort of big, a lot of people were looking to Camden right away, which is interesting. And Letitia James, you've been a city council member, a public advocate of the city of New York, and now Attorney General for the state of New York. I was reading an article the other day about how I think in the wake of Eric Garner, there was an attempt by the police department and I guess the mayor's office to engage in some diversity training, if you will, of the police, and they've spent millions and millions of dollars on firms that have been headed by white to teach diversity training. What does accountability look like by not just mayors, but also council members and other elected officials in partnership with mayors? What's that relationship like? Is there an inherent, I mean, there could be inherent tension, but there could also be some collegiality. And do you find statewide that same dynamic?
NYPD is the only department, only agency in the city of New York where when they affect a rule or put a rule in place, it is not subject to any hearings. It is not subject to the approval of the city council and or the state legislature. They just do it on their own in secret. The commissioner, for the most part, wields too much power. Again, he has power over hiring, over promotion, over discipline. And so we have to democratize NYPD. We have to look at different structures, such as perhaps a commission, where individuals are appointed to a commission who have responsibility over hiring and firing and over rules. Rules should be subject to some sort of hearing before the general public, where the general public can comment. Promotion, retention, and firing, again, should be subject to this commission. We need to give more teeth to CCRB, and their recommendations should be binding, and it should not be, again, subject to the approval of the police commissioner. Between 2014 and 2018, not one police officer in the city of New York has been removed from the force. It's been primarily, again, just a slap on the wrist. And so we really need to get serious about discipline, about training, about de-escalation, about making sure that we democratize a department which unfortunately is not accountable to no one. We need to provide more transparency and accountability to the public that they serve. We need to promote more diversity in higher ranks. And again, the city council should play a role, because the mayor of the city of New York has too much power in that power dynamic and in the structure of New York City. And so these and other recommendations are being put forth by not only myself, but members of the city council, as well as the state legislature. Again, we have seen tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, and it's important that we now, again, put forth some reforms. And last but not least, again, the police department is ill-equipped to deal with social problems. They are not social workers. And so they should not be in the business of responding to incidents where individuals are suffering from mental illness. We need a mental health professional. They should not be in a position to deal with homelessness. We need, with, again, social workers to deal with that. They should not be in our schools. They should not, again, have to deal with non-criminal traffic incidents. And that's what is meant by this whole concept, this hashtag of defunding the police, reprioritizing the budget in NYPD and having it subject, again, to the City Council of the City of New York.
Thank you. I'm gonna close in a little bit and ask you to give some closing statements. But before that, Ms. Mosby, I would ask, you recently eliminated, I think, over 500 warrants in your city. And I know we heard since Ferguson the role that warrants and fees and fines play in keeping the poor in our criminal justice system. Talk a little bit about your decision to do that, the effect that it has, and if there are other proposals like that or policies like that that you're going to be putting forth.
So absolutely. I mean, in the height of COVID, we consulted with public health experts. And one of the things that we knew was that the jails were going to be an incubator for this virus. And so we wanted to get ahead of that. And so one of the things that we did right off the bat is to set our own decarceral sort of guidelines. And I enumerated a number of offenses that during this pandemic and going forward, we would no longer be prosecuting. So please don't even bother to arrest them. In essence, we already knew we weren't prosecuting marijuana, drug use, prostitution, urinating, defecating in public, minor traffic offenses. And I enumerated all of these offenses and came out with that. And in essence, what was happening was that the police got the message. They stopped arresting individuals for those trivial sort of offenses. But then we started to look at the numbers, and we saw that for whatever reason, some of them were still coming through. And I said, well, what is this? And they said, well, people are being picked up on FTA warrants for those underlying offenses. And I said, absolutely not. This has nothing to do with public safety. We want to limit the type of interaction and engagement that police have with the community that has nothing to do with public safety. And so my team went in and we pulled about 586 cases where there were outstanding warrants on these offenses that we were no longer prosecuting, and we had to file motions to quash the warrants in front of the judges. And then in essence, we then dismissed them, thereby eliminating them for them to hopefully at some point be expunged.
Now we are to sort of piggyback on that, and I want to close by asking you to respond to this question, just from a policy perspective. What do you, for policy students, for public policy analysts, and particularly for just folks that care about these issues, what should we be looking at? What should we be paying attention? How do we mobilize going forward to help you do the work that you want to do or are intending to do? And let me add a quick point to that, because a number of people in the Q&A have raised the point that and want to highlight that not all officers are bad. Mm-hmm. And so I guess in that question about enacting policies and being able to mobilize, is there a way that we could support the good officers that are in these departments and then hold the others accountable if that's possible without a broad brush? Letitia James, please.
So I don't think anyone is painting a broad brush. My sister is a detective. I've got other relatives who are members of the police force. But it's important that, again, in a democratic society, that we have agencies and we have individuals who purport to be public servants that they are held accountable and that there is transparency in government. And in each and every agency, including NYPD, they should not be excluded from a process where they are held accountable to the public and are subject to oversight by either the city council and the state legislature. And currently, that's what we have now. What we need to do is do a complete overview of our criminal justice system, including the possibility of decriminalizing certain laws, as my co-panelist has mentioned. What laws, unfortunately, are so embedded in race that it unfortunately has a disproportionate impact on communities of color? One of the laws that we should decriminalize is decriminalizes riding your bicycle on the sidewalk. Do you know that more people of color are arrested for riding their bikes on the sidewalk than those on the Upper West Side and in Park Slope? And the question is that nothing more than a subtext for arresting individuals and searching them? I would say yes. It is a catch and release statute. And there's a significant number of catch and release crimes that need to be decriminalized and removed from enforcement by the police department. What we need to do, and what those in SEPA need to do, and at Columbia in general, a school that I studied at, is that we, again, really need to look at our criminal justice system and analyze it and look at the racial impacts and the disparate treatment of people of color in not only New York, but across the nation. In addition, another assignment for SEPA students, let's look at union contracts and see to what extent do they serve as a barrier towards progress, not only in New York, but all across this nation. We should also break down the racial lines in terms of rank and file and leadership. That's what academia can do at this point in time. Provide us with the data, with the evidence, and with the materials that we need to support our position in going forward in reforming a system which unfortunately has resulted in the death of too many people of color. But lastly, I am hopeful. I am drunk on hope always. And I do know that because of the young people who are marching, who are predominantly white at this point in time, change is coming. And again, my hope is on those young people, which is why I will again protect them and defend them, because all change in this country, all throughout history, doesn't come from elected officials. It comes from individuals who are protesting in our streets. Thank you so much, SEPA.
Thank you. And just shout out to all of the good police officers that when they caught me jumping this turnstile in high school, let me go without a fine. I appreciate that. We need more like that. Marilyn Mosby, I want to give you the last word for us, for the policy students and the experts, the elected officials, the folks that just care about justice who are with us today. How do we help you do the work that you do, and what should we be paying attention to going forward?
So I can point to one thing that just came out, and it was by a bunch of law enforcement folks. They are an attack against progressive prosecutors that are thinking about and reevaluating the types of cases that we're prosecuting and using our discretion. So I would just say, please be wary of that, and understand and recognize that we need surrogates out here sounding the trumpet and saying, absolutely not. This is what we should be talking. This is what we should be doing across this nation in this moment. And then I guess the only other thing that I would say is what just Attorney General has already eloquently stated. This is your moment. I am so incredibly encouraged. There has been a lack of leadership on the federal level, and the real leaders are on the front lines demanding change. And as the law, right, and you all are in law school, Charles Hamilton Houston said it best: lawyers can be either social engineers or parasites on society.
That's right.
Do not be a parasite on society. This is our time to be social engineers and to right the injustices of race relations in this country.
Thank you both so very much for such amazing information and marching orders going forward. I want to turn it over to Bill Emick, my colleague, to just give a couple of final thoughts before we go today.
Well, I said I was honored to have this panel here. I'm even triple honored because of what you all had to say. And my parting remark to you guys and to our audience is, to me, think about running for office. If you are out there, the people on this panel had the courage, we talked about courage, to run for office. It's not just the courage to run for office. When you get in office, you can do things. You can help make the world a better place. And if you're not going to run, I've never run. I don't think Basil has ever run either.
Yeah, I did, but I lost. It's all right.
All right. Well, that's smart, right? If you're not going to run, then vote. And one of the things that we can all do is vote in November, because there's something that can be changed. That you talked a lot about the role the federal government could play. It's not dispositive. There's so much work to be done at the local level and at the state level, but it helps when you have help from Washington. As Marilyn, you said at one point you did get help from Washington. So maybe we can return that Washington to the United States of America again. Thank you so much. An incredible education for all of us.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
And thanks again.